a wooded area behind a strip mall in Connecticut. A McDonald's nearby, two places known all too well to William Devin Howell. It was where he stopped in his van when working in neighborhoods nearby.
He called it the murder mobile. He called that field, that area where those bodies were buried, his garden.
He's a monster. Sick.
Howell abducted his victims in plain sight. He raped and killed them in a busy car park, and then dumped their bodies just meters from where people went about their daily business.
He would drive around with his victims tied up in the back of his van for 12 hours before he would park, strangle them, and then bury them in the woods.
William Devin Howell went through his murder routine 7 times in 9 months.
He felt like if he raped and murdered one woman and got caught for it, he would get death. So why not go on and rape and murder as many as possible?
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal William Devin Howell as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake? In 2003, 7 women went missing from an area of Connecticut off the Berlin Turnpike, a road once known as Gasoline Alley near New Britain. One of them was Nilsa Arizmendi, reported missing on July the 31st. She had last been seen 6 days earlier after leaving this motel, where she was living with her boyfriend Angel Sanchez, known as Ace.
Nilsa would stay here, and in the afternoons, she and Ace would walk along the Berlin Turnpike after they left the motel and arrive at the inner city section of New Britain, where Nilsa would prostitute and Ace would purchase their drugs. At the end of their evenings, they would walk all the way back to the Almar Motel.
On the day of her disappearance, Nilsa and Angel went to a grocery store car park.
They're there to purchase drugs. The boyfriend says that Nilsa was there to meet her connection, the one that she bought drugs from. And Nilsa gets in this van, and she's never heard from again.
It was Nilsa's sister who reported the 33-year-old woman missing to police. The finger of suspicion for Nilsa's disappearance immediately pointed towards Ace.
One of the suspects, of course, was Ace Sanchez. Detective Derone wondered if perhaps it was a domestic violence incident. These two had been known to have a rough and tumble relationship and get physical with one another and have verbal altercations. So it wasn't outside of the realm of possibility that maybe Ace Sanchez was responsible for the disappearance of Nilsa Arizmendi.
The police brought him in for questioning, but he passed a polygraph test, insisting that he had nothing to do with his girlfriend's disappearance. Instead, he named William Devin Howell as the man Nilsa was last seen with.
And he describes a blue van. He describes the figure, the same kind of body shape and style of that of Howell.
Nilsa and Ace already knew Howell. He would sometimes give them lifts up and down the turnpike in his van. He also would party with them in their motel room. They smoked crack together, they smoked weed, they sometimes drank together.
William Devin Howell was a gardener and odd job man tending homes and gardens in the affluent tree-lined streets of New Britain. Heavy-set at 5'9" and 220 pounds, with long, dirty blonde hair, he had his middle name tattooed on his bicep. He kept the tools of his trade in his beaten-up black and blue Ford van. It had 2 broken windows that were covered with plywood. It was also where he sometimes slept, and where he took prostitutes that he picked up off the Berlin Turnpike. The road was the place to go to pick up sex workers, and that's what he liked to do.
Drove around in a van and he cut people's yards. It is yet again a story of a killer who blended in, who did not stand out. He wasn't unique. He would be somebody that would be very commonplace to see in anybody's neighborhood.
Howell would admit that he had given Nilsa a ride, but told the authorities that he let her out further down the road and she walked away. Detectives were not convinced. Suspicious, they decided to trace the van, which led them to the owner, Dorothy Holcomb.
The police first went to Dorothy Holcomb's house, and she was also Howell's girlfriend. Dorothy said he wasn't home. Even though police could see the figure of a man, a big man, through the curtains, and that he almost never drove the van, that in fact another male friend, drove the van.
Detectives then decided to forensically analyze the van.
Despite the efforts to clean that van, there's one small piece of evidence, and that is blood. Indeed, it's the victim's blood inside the van, and she's the last one seen with him, and you now have an identification. And so what you would have now is a very good circumstantial case.
But Howell refused to admit what he'd done to Nilsa. He claimed she and her boyfriend Ace had fought in the back of his van, and Ace had hit her and spilled her blood in the van. Police didn't believe him. Howell's trial for murder was looming. Believing that detectives had a strong case against him, Howell made a pragmatic move.
You can't necessarily prove absolute murder off of one drop of blood in a van, but a reasonable person could come to that conclusion. So with a very circumstantial case, you have William Howell that pleads guilty.
I think what motivated him to accept that plea was the fact that the prosecution had blood DNA evidence on hand showing that Nilsa Arizmendi's blood was in that van. Now, granted, it was just a single drop of blood, but they had it. Also at that time, the prosecution had an eyewitness who saw William Devin Howell drive off with Nilsa Arizmendi in his van back in July 2003. He was the last person to be seen with Nilsa Arizmendi.
He pleaded guilty to manslaughter. Without a body, prosecutors were forced to accept his plea. He was sentenced to 15 years, but cops had a nagging suspicion they hadn't uncovered the whole story.
When the investigators searched Howell's van back in 2004 and 2005, they didn't just discover one DNA sample belonging to Nilsa Arizmendi. They also discovered blood belonging to an unknown victim. So at that time, law enforcement knew that there was likely another person that Howell had killed.
But who? No connection was made with the other women reported missing off the Berlin Turnpike.
Often there's the assumption that these people just fell off the radar. Perhaps they overdosed on their drugs, they skipped town, they got in trouble, were sent out of state and incarcerated somewhere else. So not much was being done.
And all of the women were dead, killed at the hands of William Devin Howell. Howell remained in prison on a single conviction for manslaughter and due for release sometime in 2018. He'd evaded capture because of the lifestyle of the missing women. He was a serial killer, but one whose mistakes were as yet unknown to detectives. What sort of person was William Devin Howell in 2003?
Howell was a heavy drinker, and he was also addicted to paying for sex.
Anne Howard, a local attorney, got to know Howell well as she researched what had happened to the women who were reported and officially classified as missing. She lives in a Connecticut home just a few miles from what she would discover were the killing grounds where Howell drove his van.
Howell began to solicit prostitutes at a very young age. He describes for me the first time that he drove to Newport News, and he went to the red light district of this city in Virginia. He was only 14 years old. He stole his father's car in the middle of the night and drove silently off and picked up his first prostitute. After that, he told me it became his secret addiction, soliciting prostitutes in the middle of the night. By the age of 12, William Devin Howell's mother got sick with breast cancer. She was at the time in her early 50s. She was sort of a source of stability in his life. She gave him protection and routine. She was a strong disciplinarian.
Without her in his life, Howell seems to have gone off the rails.
What was out of the ordinary was the extent to which he was drinking throughout his adolescence. He told me that by the time he was in high school, there really wasn't a day when he wasn't drinking alcohol, sometimes in the morning before he went to school. He only kept his driver's license for about a year and a half before he got into a drunk driving accident.
Alongside his drinking, another addiction, sex.
By the time he was in his 30s, Howell estimated that he had slept with over 1,000 prostitutes.
The teenage William paid for his habit any way he could. He had a paper route. He did odd jobs for the neighbors, mowing lawns, sweeping up leaves. He worked as a cashier in a 7-Eleven. Anything to scrape together the $20 that he needed for his next fix, his next hookup with a sex worker. His addiction, coupled with the loss of his mother at such a young age, seems to have had a profound effect on the way that he viewed women, even the mother of his children.
I think he had a very strict binary code in his head about the difference between good girls and bad girls. And he has told me that the mother of his children he considered to be a good girl. She did not drink. She did not use drugs. She was a good mother to the children.
And then there were the women that Howell considered bad girls. They were sometimes doing drugs or selling themselves on the street. They were drinking. They were doing dangerous things. And they contrasted with the women in his life that he considered good girls.
It was what Howell would call the bad girls who were officially missing as he lay in prison on a single manslaughter charge. Around that time, Anne Howard became intrigued by the mystery of the missing women, and she made contact with the man she came to know as Bill Howell.
Hey Bill, can you hear me okay? Because I'm on speakerphone.
Yeah, I can tell though, it sounds like an echo.
Okay.
A man who freely admitted to her his disdain for sex workers.
It was their lifestyle. It was their lifestyle and my discontent of it.
And the contempt you felt was because they were selling their bodies on the streets for drugs, right?
Yeah, I felt like they were selling their bodies on the street. They were putting themselves at risk. They probably spread diseases to husbands and boyfriends. And I don't know if disdain is the right word for it or discontent.
During the time that Anne Howard was researching the mystery of the disappearance of women off the Berlin Turnpike, Howell remained unsuspected in their murders. When would detectives make a breakthrough? What mistake had the killer made? Most of those that Bill Howell came into contact with on the outside and inside prison on a daily basis thought he was friendly, genial. His defense attorney, Bill Petzold, certainly got that impression.
He was an affable Southern gentleman, had a good sense of humor, and was very easygoing and laid back. I still try to look at him and say, could he really have done this? I still didn't see him in that context of committing these, vicious crimes.
There was nothing gentle about the way William Devin Howell treated his first victim, Melanie Ruth Cavallini, an accomplished pianist in her teenage years from a comfortable Connecticut background. but who fell foul of opioid addiction.
She was strong, beautiful. She was a good mom. She wanted to be better. And she fought to be better. But not strong enough to do that.
Jessica Camillini recalls the moment that Melanie's family realized she was missing. It wasn't unusual for the mother of two to disappear for weeks, sometimes months at a time, but she would check in with her children. This time it was different.
She had a really strong addiction, but she went through phases, and she would be there, and there'd be a few months when she'd be gone. We didn't know where she was. And no matter what, though, she would always reach out to her kids. Always. So, I mean, when it came to the point to where she was gone for a year and she didn't talk to her kids, you knew something was wrong. Because even if she was in trouble and couldn't come back in fear of being arrested, she'd reach out to her kids. And she didn't.
Jessica remembers her sister as a big personality who was attracted to the wrong people. In her mid-teens, Melanie's new friends introduced her to drugs. Her family found themselves powerless to help as they watched her personality change.
She wasn't shy. She was bold, strong, daring, crazy. She was. She used to love saying things to get a reaction. Yeah, she was funny. She used to make me laugh.
But then Jessica saw a change in her sister.
I can remember being around 16. She was around 17. I can remember seeing a change and her just changing, getting into trouble. Our room was on the 3rd floor, and then we had a staircase, circular staircase down to the 2nd floor, and there was a washer and dryer there, and she would always do a load of laundry late at night, so my parents couldn't hear her sneaking out.
The last time that Jessica saw Melanie was typical of the way Mel's life had become. It isn't a happy memory of her beloved big sister.
I was, I believe, 8 months pregnant with my son. I flew to Connecticut, visiting family, and I went over to her place, and unfortunately, she was passed out on the couch again. I'm not sure what the circumstances were behind it, but I didn't get to talk to her.
It was soon after that Melanie Camillini encountered William Devon Howell.
So Howell describes to me the day in which he decided, it was a very deliberate decision on his part, that he was going to rape his first prostitute. He was going to make the fantasy a reality. He went to the hardware store, and he explains that he was in a state of nervous excitement. He bought the duct tape, the cords, the rip ties, the weapons that he would need to not just carry out the rape of this prostitute, but to kill her as well. He knew that he would have to kill after he raped to conceal the evidence.
Howell picked up Melanie Camillini, took her to a secluded spot, and raped her.
He then tied her to the back bench of the van, kept her in that same location until he could have a cool down period for several hours. During that night, he would off and on rape her and slip into what he would describe as something of a catnap, where he would doze off and then come to again and commit the act all over.
After keeping Melanie Camellini in the back of his van for 12 hours, Howell decided it was time to finish what he'd started.
Now, with respect to the moments before Melanie died, I think that's what is the most heartbreaking, at least for me, to hear firsthand that this woman begged for her life. And William Devin Howell tells me that he hit her on the temple very hard with a hammer with the intention of knocking her out and killing her that way. And he said it didn't even faze her. She put her hand to her head and she said, "Please don't kill me, I have children."
This was a pivotal moment for Howell. He could have let his victim live. He could have ended his killing spree. There's every chance Melanie would have survived the brutal attack that she'd suffered.
She was strong, very strong person, even physically. She was tiny, but still strong.
Howell considered not killing Melanie, but then he realized that he had just spent the last 12 hours raping and torturing her. If he didn't kill her, she would go to the police.
He thought momentarily, maybe I won't kill her. I don't know if I can kill her. But he decided he had to go through with it. And at that point, he strangled her. So then once you killed the first victim, Melanie Camellini, you told me in your words it was game on. Like you felt like I've got nothing left to lose, right?
It was kind of like that. It was, I had crossed that line.
He knew he had nothing left to lose by going on to rape and kill anybody he wanted, because there was a death penalty in the state of Connecticut at that time. He felt like if he raped and murdered one woman and got caught for it, he would get death. So why not go on and rape and murder as many as possible, because ultimately the consequences will be the same.
What Howell did next was perhaps almost as horrifying, as macabre, as the murder that he had just committed.
It was in February, and the ground was frozen. So after strangling Melanie, he tried to bury her in that frozen ground in those woods. He could not do it. And so he had to keep her body in that van for a full 2 weeks.
He describes how he wrapped that body up and slept with a dead body for 2 weeks because it was too cold to bury that body in the ground outside.
He actually dismantled her jaw and he sliced off her fingertips in a sloppy and frantic attempt to try to remove any traces of this woman's identity after killing her.
He went to the wooded ravine behind the strip mall and put her body in a big plastic barrel. He left it there while he went off to Virginia for several months.
When the weather warmed, he returned to New Britain and buried Melanie's body behind the strip mall.
This grotesque sequence of actions, tying his victims up, raping them, driving around to different locations in his van, killing them, and then dumping their body, would become a well-rehearsed routine for William Devin Howell.
First off, he would stop his van over there behind the strip mall and dump the parcel or the body of his victim wrapped in garbage bags deep into the ravine. And then what he would do is he'd get back into his van and go over to the McDonald's parking lot, park his car, and come back to this location where we're at right now. There's a trail, as you can see. It goes into sort of a meadow-like littered area. And William Devin Howell would walk this trail and make a sharp right that led into the ravine where the parcel that he had left was left in the ravine, he would retrieve a spade, a shovel that he had stored behind the guardrail, and then he would drag that body along with his shovel about a few hundred yards into the woods to the location that he was known to call his garden, which is where he buried in very shallow graves the 7 bodies of the people that he killed.
Who would be the next to fall to his terrifying compulsion? And what would it take to stop him? Despite the scale of the crimes of William Devon Howell in such a short period in 2003, he was not being investigated. Even as he served time for the manslaughter of one woman whose profile matched those missing, he was not in the frame for their murders. Their bodies had been buried by him here, a 14-acre stretch of woodland behind a busy strip mall. Marilyn Mendez Gonzalez was one who ended up in what Bill Howell would come to call his garden.
In May of 2003, he was driving through the streets of Waterbury, and he came upon Marilyn Gonzalez. She was also a young mother who had a drug addiction and was turning tricks on the street. As with Camellini and most of his other victims, Howell knew that that night the woman that he paid was going to end up dead. He knew that he would rape Marilyn Gonzalez, and as with all of his other victims, that took place over a 12-hour period. On again, off again, in between rapes, he would bind his captives to the back bench of his van, duct tape their mouths, and drive them to different locations. He never stayed in one location long enough to be seen by anybody. So he would simply drive around and commit 7 or 8 of these rapes and then end it with the strangulation.
Marilyn was just 26 years old. She was the mother of 2 little girls. If she were alive today, she would be a grandmother. But she ended up buried in a shallow grave, yards from a fast food parking lot, where her body would lie undiscovered for over a decade.
Although this strip mall is located on a busy roadway with a busy upscale shopping mall across the street and the strip mall itself with the parking lot to the left, the area to the right is almost inaccessible to the public. The brush gets thicker as you go along.
I remember going to the crime scene and I walked down the embankment in my dress shoes, and it was kind of muddy and slippery. And when I was down there, I felt like I was in an amphitheater, kind of looking up at the parking lot area, which you couldn't really see the parking lot with the trees that were there. And I thought, this is actually a pretty interesting place to have buried bodies. You know, you'd think, well, people might be driving by and look down, but it wasn't a place that you would suspect.
There are no trespassing signs that line the guardrail and the fencing. There are no walking trails. This isn't a place that anyone would choose to go. Not only that, but when you look at the soil itself, this is really swampy soil. Howell told me that the graves he dug were only about 2 to 3 feet at the most in depth. And that was because the water table out here is so high. And so water would actually start to emerge as he was digging the graves.
After killing his first victims, Howell began snatching sex workers from the street at an alarming rate.
In June 2003, Howell killed his 3rd victim, but this time things went a little differently. Danny Wisnut also went by the name of Janice Roberts. They met outside of a bar after closing time, and she got into his van.
This was a transgender man who was dressed as a woman. He had long, silky black hair, Howell states, and a short miniskirt and high heels. And so, thinking Daniel Winston is a female prostitute, he invites Mr. Winston into his van. During the transaction that took place, Howell puts his hand on the head of Winston and pulls off a wig. He becomes enraged that this man has deceived him into this vulnerable position. He throws Daniel Winston against the wall of the van and tells me that he punched him out twice and then quickly strangled him.
Howell later said that he killed Danny to stop him from, quote, duping anyone else. But it also looked like Howell's rage and his addiction to killing was getting even more out of control. He wasn't planning the way he had been before.
Yet still, Howell avoided detection for his crimes.
So this was again a case of society's castaways, society's most vulnerable people, people who others might look at as perhaps not worth the effort, that are cast off. And so nobody notices that they're missing.
In some ways, Howell was hiding in plain sight. During the day, he was driving around in a van. At night, he was using that same van to lure vulnerable women in, to attack them and kill them. Later, he would leave their bodies in fairly public places, quite close to where people were just doing their everyday shopping.
In midsummer 2003, Howell imprisoned, raped, and murdered 2 vulnerable women. The first was Diane Cusack.
She had been addicted to drugs for many years and lived a very hard life on the streets. Howell picked her up in New Britain, Connecticut, and went through his similar routine of raping and strangulation.
Diane was in her early 50s when she died. She had been out of contact with her family for a few years, and no one reported her missing.
After strangling her in the McDonald's parking lot, he buried her behind the strip mall right next door.
The drive-in McDonald's played a big part in Howell's deadly killing spree.
Howell would also go through this very drive-through with some of his victims held captive in the back of his van, tied up and duct taped. And he said to me that he would turn the music up high so no one would hear him or hear the victims if they were screaming or cried for help. And during that time, he would actually order food through the drive-through and ask his victims if they also wanted something to eat, which to me just shows the callousness and the absolute lack of empathy of this man, that as these poor women sat held captive on the back bench, he was ordering food and eating.
Howell was carrying out his crimes in full view of the world, relying on the fact that his victims were never seen by witnesses climbing into his van. He was trusting that no one plying their trade along the turnpike really knew who he was, and that few cared whether or not his victims came back alive. Many did, but that wasn't his calculation. Having already killed 3 women, it was now that he picked up Nilsa Arizmendi. She wanted to buy drugs. Sex was on the agenda.
What happened was, when she refused to finish that transaction, he grew very angry.
When Howell picked up Nilsa Arizmendi, he hadn't been planning on killing her.
He decided in that split second, I am going to rape and kill this woman.
It would be months before he would be arrested in connection with the disappearance of Nilsa, time enough to abduct and murder his 6th and 7th victims.
And the first of those victims in August of 2003 was Mary Jane Menard.
She was in quite a difficult, dark place in her life. She had struggled with alcoholism, but she'd been sober for more than 10 years. She had trained to be a substance abuse counselor so that she could help other people who were going through what she'd been through, but things started to go wrong for her again.
So Mary Jane Menard had back surgery, and at that time she was faced with chronic pain. She was prescribed by her doctors pain medications, and as is the case, unfortunately, with people who struggle with chronic pain,
the opioids at some point just weren't enough. And as many find out, they're also very expensive. And so Mary Jane Menard, unfortunately, began to use heroin to help cope with her chronic pain.
She was 40 years old. She went out to buy cigarettes and was never seen again.
He picked up Mary Jane Menard on the streets and went through his typical routine of holding her captive in his van for 12 hours, raping her off and on, and eventually strangling her.
This was also the fate of Joyvelin Martinez. Joyvelin had been a track star at school before falling victim to drugs. She lived with her mother, who raised the alarm when her daughter failed to show up for her birthday celebrations.
Joyvelin Martinez was Howell's last victim. She was a very beautiful young girl. She was only 23 years old at the time of her death. William Devin Howell picked her up on Hillside Avenue in Hartford, Connecticut.
Howell went through what was becoming his usual routine. He kept her captive in his van for 12 hours, then he strangled her and dumped her body.
It was the face of Joyvelin Martinez that would one day trigger an extraordinary confession from William Howell, who had killed all of the women, but was in prison for the manslaughter of just one of them. In 2007, the ghosts of all of the people that he had killed were not prepared to lie quietly any longer and began to give up their secrets. In August 2007, as Howell was serving a 15-year stretch, a hunter roaming the woodland off the Berlin Turnpike made a terrifying discovery.
A hunter was walking through the brush with his dog and found what looked like a human bone sticking out of the ground. He called the police, and they began an excavation of the area.
Well, there was a discovery of, I think, as I recall, 3 skeletal remains in that location, but they weren't able to link anything.
The detectives have a hunter who's in a field and he discovers bones. They get sent off to a lab. And you're waiting. Who do these bones belong to? Where do I begin my investigation on these bones?
It was a eureka moment for the Connecticut detectives with a long list of missing persons to trace, or at least it should have been. The crime labs that were tasked with finding out who the bones belonged to made error after error. Years followed before identifications were made.
And you're still wondering. You're waiting for those results, that frustration of the waiting. And you have this dysfunctional lab that hasn't processed the evidence yet.
Not until 2014 would detectives finally be able to break the news to victims' families that their loved ones, 3 of them at least, had been found murdered.
The 3 bodies were named as Diane Cusack, Joyvelin Martinez, and Mary Jane Menard. For the families, this was halfway to getting closure, but there was still no one on trial for having killed them.
Police vowed to keep searching the 15-acre woodland. It was a mammoth task. At this stage, they had no idea what linked the 3 women whose bodies that they had already identified, but they were determined to find out if any other victims were buried there. Then, help came from an unexpected quarter, the prison where Bill Howell was incarcerated, and also where a man called Jonathan Mills was serving time.
Almost out of nowhere, you receive information to go speak to an inmate. An inmate has information on this case. And when you go and you interview that inmate, he reveals to those detectives detail after detail. He is able to identify some by their first names of who these victims are. And it is in such a manner that the detectives, it's like switching a light switch on. This inmate is specifically talking about those bones found in that field.
Howell's cellmate came forward to inform on him. He said that they'd been playing cards in their cell, and one of the cards had a picture of a missing woman on it. That woman was Joyvelin Martinez.
In an attempt to track down missing people, police put faces of those who had simply disappeared onto the backs of playing cards and distributed them throughout prisons. They were hoping that inmates might recognize faces and volunteer information to the authorities.
The playing cards is a technique that the police and the prosecution have used to try to solve cold cases. And on the back side of the cards are faces of missing, of deceased individuals whose cases are unsolved. And they have their phone number, hotline to call. And a lot of inmates take advantage of that, either because they know or they don't know, but they're going to try to pretend that they know information to try to get their sentences commuted or shortened or something of that sort, some kind of benefit.
Howell saw Joyveline's face and told his cellmate, "I know her, I know where she is."
He starts to tell the story to a cellmate. And as he tells his story, it's almost like a steam engine going down a hill. It gets faster and faster and faster. And he reveals the most intimate details of every crime that only somebody who knew these crimes would be able to tell. What gets William Howell in the end is his braggadocious attitude that he has with his cellmate.
I think the police suspected Bill Howell of being involved in at least some of these unsolved murders, but once Jonathan Mills came forward and disclosed what Bill had told him in confidence during a jail discussion, and Jonathan drew a map. It wasn't a perfect map, but it kind of gave a general sense of where bodies may be located.
And that cellmate was not from that particular area, is able to draw a pretty detailed diagram of where William Howell told them these bodies were buried. And sure enough, behind a supermarket, William Howell's, what he called his garden, was located.
The map wasn't all that Howell's cellmate Jonathan Mills was able to give detectives. Howell had shared some truly disturbing details about his crimes.
He told his cellmate about the time when he drove around with Melanie Camellini's body in his van for 2 weeks and called her his baby.
He refers to his own vehicle. It's not other people that referred to his vehicle as the murder mobile. He called it the murder mobile. He called that field, that area where those bodies were buried, his garden.
He called himself a sick ripper and said that he had a monster inside of him.
He said to Mills that he was going to go back to his bed in his cell that night to dream about his garden and his buried bodies that he had collected in his garden.
Detectives and forensic teams followed the map drawn by Howell's cellmate. One by one, they uncovered 4 more bodies. They were identified as belonging to Nilsa Arizmendi, Marilyn Mendez-Gonzalez, Melanie Ruth Camellini, and Danny Lee Wishtant.
And then they were able to really link their DNA, the DNA of the bones that they uncovered, with other evidence that they uncovered from Bill's van.
4 more families were informed that their missing loved ones had been brutally slain, including Melanie Camellini's sister Jessica.
Mom kind of kept me informed with what was going on, and she had called me and said they want to meet with me. So I kind of knew. I knew something was going on. But she said that she would know. Ironically enough, it was on Mel's birthday. Mom said, I'll call you tomorrow after I meet with him. And I remember her calling, and all she said was, "It's her."
You go back and you look at the lives of the victims, you see a face. You see what they look like. It's no longer just a bunch of bones in a field. It's somebody's beautiful daughter, somebody's beautiful sister, And it's all the things that make William Howell the ultimate thief. He stole weddings, he stole futures, he stole celebrations, all from these families. He stole perhaps the hope of redemption and reconciliation that the families were longing for, that they will never get, because William Howell buried those bodies in his garden.
How do you cope? It's horrific. You don't think about it. I don't. Didn't happen. You ask me about my childhood, you ask me about things I did with Mel, it's hard to remember. Because I don't want to. Because you don't. You don't want to come to the realization of what really happened. It wasn't a car accident. It wasn't health issues. How do you cope? How do you process?
As the overwhelming evidence stacked up against him, Howell finally admitted his guilt. He was the last person seen with Nilsa Arizmendi. In many ways, that was the mistake he made. Though serving time for her manslaughter only, he had then bragged of his deeds to a fellow convict. His story was finally ready to be told, in full, to Ann Howard, a lawyer and confidant of a man who was Connecticut's worst serial killer.
I guess the saddest part is that even though you're suffering in that isolated cell, you know, at least you have a life. Your victims don't.
Yeah, you know what? People say that, but I might be alive, Ann, but this damn sure ain't living.
Right.
I have a life of being miserable for the rest of my days, and I'd rather be dead than wake up miserable for the rest of my life every day, and that's what I have to serve now.
Yeah, sometimes when you speak like that, it makes me think like you almost felt like you were putting them out of their misery.
I didn't feel like that at the time, but I mean, in a way that, you know, they're out of their misery.
Would Howell have continued to kill if he hadn't been locked up for the death of Nilsa Arizmendi? Even his own attorney struggles when answering that question.
Would this have continued? The answer, I can't answer that for you. But that's certainly a question that looms out there with a lot of people, whether if he had not been apprehended for the Arizmendi murder and received a 15-year jail sentence on that, would this type of behavior have continued? And that's for people to talk about, but nobody really knows.
If he had not, through his own words, damned himself to a lifetime in prison, he may yet still be driving around and be not just Connecticut's most notorious serial killer, but the world's most notorious serial killer.
The more Bill Howell killed, the more mistakes he made. His first was snatching up a woman, Nilsa Arizmendi, whose boyfriend could identify him and his murder-mobile. When he was doing time for her death, he committed his biggest mistake, giving in to a burning urge to brag to his cellmate about the horrific things he had done.
William Howell is in prison. He spills his guts to a cellmate, to a fellow inmate, who is later able to help the detectives in intimate details of what William Howell told him. That's the biggest mistake.
A serial killer was finally unmasked by his mistakes. William Devon Howell was sentenced to 360 years in prison.